Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Happy Mother's Day, everybody. Happy Mother's Day. I see Sharon Comfort back today. Good to see Sharon. That's fine. It's good to see Sharon, though. Thanks for leaving the class, Sharon. Have a good Mother's Day. No, it's great to see Sharon back and doing well. I think it's only been 5 weeks. Is that right, Sharon? 5? Yep, so she's doing good. Again, happy Mother's Day to everybody out there. It's good to see everybody's face on a beautiful day. We're going to talk about Jerusalem for the next 2 weeks. Again, when Daniel and I have talked periodically over before the quarter started, during the quarter, the He Was Here series, the last 5 weeks are Jerusalem. So it's a lot of Jerusalem. And so we're going to do it. I'm going to do a little bit different than what the book does. My goal today was just to obviously talk about Jerusalem from a historic standpoint, from its beginning, from what we know about its beginnings in the Old Testament to certainly the New Testament and Jesus' time there. And again, we know some of Jesus' time there, certainly probably obviously more about his time in Jerusalem than any other place, but we probably don't know everything that happened there. As John says, it would take a lot of writings to keep track of everything. So we know what we know. I don't want to talk too much about modern day Jerusalem. I'll talk a little bit about some modern day thought, but I'm not going to probably open that up for much conversation today. And then talk a little bit about some of the surrounding areas of Jerusalem that we see in Scripture: the Garden of Gethsemane, Mount of Olives, Golgotha, those places. When Daniel's up here in a couple weeks, he's going to talk some about the New Jerusalem, I believe. And so I'm going to talk about the old today. Let me see if this is working here, if I got it on. I think one time I didn't think it was working because I didn't have it on. Assume it was left on. Let's see if this works. There we go. It is working. Okay. Or did Justin do that? Did you do that, Justin? Okay. All right, I guess it's not. Let me see. We'll try it one more time here. You know what? Probably not. There we go. Okay, there we go. Got it now. So all scriptures, again, will be in italics from the New American Standard Version today as we talk. So you see, now I think I've got it. Wrong one. Well, I hit to the right. I thought that's what worked. What's that? Right click. Well, I'm clicking it to the arrow to the right. I thought that's what did it. Not right. So I thought that's what I did before, but that's you. You got it? Okay, thanks, Justin. Matthew 23, 37 through 39. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I think, from this verse from Jesus' mouth, or this paragraph from Jesus' mouth, Jerusalem certainly obviously had great meaning to Jesus, and we'll talk a little bit about why it's such a meaningful place. And clearly he spent a lot of time there, probably, again, more than we know. But, we have the most information we have about Jerusalem, I would say, comes from the Passion Week, and that being the week many call the Passion Week, that being the week of Jesus and his crucifixion. And I think, there's a lot to digest, certainly in that week. And so next week, my goal was to try to look at that week And again, that's a lot of information, but look at that week and look at the places involved in that week if I can. Zondervan has a nice outline too of the events of that week in a map and kind of showing you where things probably happened. And so I want to do that next week. But also, again, there's going to be a lot about Jesus' time in Jerusalem here in the next couple of years. And I think for good, ultimately, because it will lead to lots of discussion. I know that Mel Gibson is making his sequel to The Passion of the Christ, which will be coming out, I think, next year. And then also the series, The Chosen, and Daniel's talked about that series some, and I'm in season 3 of that right now, but they will be coming out with season 6, I believe, next year, which is the Passion Week, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So there's going to be a lot to talk about Jerusalem in the upcoming 12 to 24 months. And then we know that in this passage, obviously, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that in AD 70, the Romans would destroy Jerusalem and the temple, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Next slide, please, Justin. John 4, 21 through 24, and I guess a little introduction with these verses. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." This is, of course, a passage that is involved in the story of the Samaritan woman. I think we talked about that actually one week, one of the cities we looked at with Daniel, this story. But what I'm trying to highlight here is Jerusalem is certainly an important place from a historic standpoint, and certainly for all religious, if you really look at all religious groups, they look at it, or the major religions, I would say, they look at it as a holy place, or certainly a place of great value from a physical standpoint. And we have, and again, I don't want to focus on this, and so I'm just going to bring it up, and I think it's something to read up more, because I struggle with these concepts and I'm no expert in it. But Christian Zionism, a lot of the millennialism thoughts focus on Jerusalem and its importance, and we have many in our government that would subscribe to some of those thoughts and beliefs. And me personally, and this again is my opinion about Jerusalem, I think it's certainly a place that if you got a chance to visit, I think it's an awesome experience for you to see, the places where Jesus truly was in his physical body. But I think, Jesus says here, the hour is coming when it's not about where you worship, it's not about the place. And subsequently here, he talks about the temple of God being, we are the temple. So I think that's important to recognize, that to me, Jerusalem is a special place from a historic standpoint, from a sentimental standpoint. But I think, again, we'll talk about the New Jerusalem here in a couple weeks, but I think there's some other things that sometimes we focus maybe too much on the physical, the historic kind of that actual area. And I did want to read one other passage, and I think I'm just going to have to take my glasses off nowadays because I can't read with them on. But John 18:36, Jesus before Pilate, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." And I'll just leave it with that with you at this point. And I think, again, things to think about as we think about Jerusalem and our current political climate and world climate. Next slide, please. Okay. I don't know why that slide. There we go. So Jerusalem, this is just a photo of Jerusalem. I've never been there. I think we have some people here that have had a chance to travel there, and happy that you're able to have that unique experience. But it is a true multicultural place, because you have people of all again, I would say the major religious groups that focus on one God, who that God is, but, you know, a little bit different, but Jews, Christians, Muslims, and it has been under the rule of Israel since 1967. I'm not a great world history person, and I've always struggled with more the modern day understanding of Israel and some of the conflicts they've had in the West Bank and all that. No expert in it, but my thought is it's never going to end. There's always going to be that kind of conflict until this world ends. I did want to read, this is just from Britannica. I think it's just a general nice short paragraph, but Jerusalem stands on a hill at an elevation of about 2,500 feet. The modern unified city is the largest municipality in Israel or the West Bank. And again, the West Bank is that, I kind of think it as like, I mean, Israel essentially, you know, says it's theirs, but others say it's theirs. And so that's kind of that area of conflict all the time. And is the heart of an urban agglomeration that spills outside the city limits into adjacent areas of both jurisdictions. At the center of the modern municipality is the Old City, a walled medieval enclosure of less than half a square mile from which the entire city has grown. And you know, you think of Jerusalem and you kind of think of the Old City. I think that's the picture you probably have in your mind. But Jerusalem, to my understanding, is much like a lot of other cities in this country in terms of if you go outside of it. I think they have shopping malls. They have all those kind of things that you would think of maybe in an American city. So there's some westernized aspects of it as you get outside of that area. To the east, the city looks down on the Dead Sea and across the Jordan River to the arid mountains of eastern Jordan, which would be the biblical mountains of Moab. And to the west, it faces the coastal plain and the Mediterranean Sea, which is only about 35 miles away. So it's not a long car ride to the Great Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. Next slide, please. This is, again, the map from Bible Atlas, and this is, of course, looking at more of a biblical time frame, but you can see kind of where it sits there. The Dead Sea, the Jordan River to your east, obviously the Mediterranean Sea to your west. Bethlehem, not too far away. Bethany, as we've talked about, I think that was the first week, actually, we talked about Bethany and Lazarus, not too far away, obviously, also. Next slide. So the early years, wanted to look at Genesis 14, verse 18. So this is really the first passage that we see Jerusalem in Scripture that I'm aware of, and it's not called Jerusalem at the time, but we believe it to be reflective of Jerusalem subsequently. It's called Salem. Salem or Shalom is peace. So Jerusalem is the city of peace or the foundation of peace. And if we look in Genesis 14:18, we learn about Melchizedek. So this is after there was a war in the time of Abraham, and I believe if I'm saying this right again, Lot, I believe, and his family were captured. I might get this story because I didn't look back through it. But anyway, Abraham goes up against these folks to get his family back, and then he was able to be successful in that conflict. And then there's a king who's also called a priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek. We look in again Genesis 14 verses 17 and 18. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all. So king of Salem, this is again would be sometime 2000-ish BC, I believe. So we know that Jerusalem's been around for quite a while, and it was clearly a city of royalty at the time, with Melchizedek being its leader and priest, and he was obviously a follower of God, as we see from the verses there. We see in Judges that the people of Israel, and this is specifically the tribe of Benjamin, in Judges specifically 121 there, as they're going into the promised land, the tribe of Benjamin does not drive all of the Jebusites. So another name for Jerusalem was Jebus or Jebus. The Jebusites were a Canaanite people. If you go back to the genealogies, you'll see them in the genealogies in the Old Testament. And they didn't drive them out as they were told to. And so the Jebusites were still there as the Israelites first kind of went into the promised land. I find that interesting because the Benjamites, and I think about not driving the people out or not following what God wanted them to do, similar to a descendant of Benjamin, Saul, not doing what he was told to do in the Old Testament in terms of totally destroying the Amalekites and all of the repercussions that came from that. Next slide. The city of David. So this is the story of David, or the history of David and the events of David taking Jerusalem to be the capital for Israel. And interesting enough, again, you learn when you teach. That's one of the good things about getting a chance to present or teach, is that it's good for me because I learn things or things I didn't pick up on before that I should have. But when David first became king, he was in Hebron. So Hebron is south of Jerusalem. His kingdom did not initially, he was not king in Jerusalem. Saul reigned from Gibeah, is my understanding. So Saul did not reign from Jerusalem either. So this here in 2 Samuel, and there's a parallel story in, I can't remember if it's Chronicles or Kings, but there's a parallel story. Now the king, this is 2 Samuel 5, 6 through 9. Now the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, and they said to David, "You shall not come in here, but the blind and lame will turn you away," thinking, David cannot enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul through the water tunnel. Therefore they say, the blind or the lame shall not come into the house." So David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Millo and inward. So David sought out a different location to govern or reign from for many reasons. One, Jerusalem was a more central location in the kingdom. It kind of bordered the Benjamin and Judah tribal lands. It was a much more easily defensible location, sat on kind of a ridge surrounded by valleys. Economically, it stood on trade routes from the north and south and the east and west. It had an adequate water supply. This is all from Howard Voss from New Illustrated Bible Manners and Customs, which is a book I've looked at a little bit. You see the first use of the word Zion here. Originally, Zion was the southernmost hill of the city, but subsequently that term was applied to the entire city, calling it Zion. And I mentioned a parallel passage. It actually was from 1 Chronicles 11, 4 through 9. We know that Joab became the commander of David's army from this attack. The thought is that there was some sort of a secret water tunnel into the city so if they were under attack, the people could still have resources, that important resource of water. And so the thought is that it was a sneak attack through this tunnel is how they were able to take the city. That again, the people said, "You're not going to come in here. Even the blind and lame can turn you away," because they thought it was so defensible. And apparently Joab was leading that charge, and then subsequently becomes David's commander after this story. So interesting history and events there that took place. Next slide. Well, Jerusalem's important because of the temple. Another, obviously, that we talked about, the story of the Samaritan woman and the Samaritans who were worshiping on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans, focused only on the Pentateuch. They did not look at the other scriptures as scripture. The Jews worshiping in Jerusalem at the temple that was built by Solomon. Next slide, please. So the temple, obviously it makes Jerusalem important because that's the place of worship. 960 BC to 586 BC, that's the time of the Temple of Solomon, how long it stood, how long it lasted. And then 586, the Babylonians destroy the temple as they overtake Judah. Then we have 515 BC, Nehemiah and his, with the assistance of Cyrus, king of Persia, they are able to rebuild a temple, not certainly in the scale of the original temple or the glory of the original temple, but they're able to rebuild a temple. And then you have Herod the Great, who you kind of, some writers, if you look at it, kind of say it's the third temple, but really it's just an expansion of the second temple from about 19 or 20 BC to 64 AD. That process took all of those years, according to the historians and biblical records. And then, of course, that temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, prophesied and talked about, obviously, in Scripture on many occasions. I wanted to look at John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21, which I found interesting. This is another passage that I had slipped my recollection in the past, but John 2, 19 through 21. So this is early in Jesus' ministry. This is actually just after the miracle at Cana, the turning of water into wine. The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Well, we know Jesus is talking about his body and his crucifixion there, but the Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days." So historians, believe from that obviously we have other records indicating the time frame of the temple, but it gives you an idea of the time frame of what's happening with Jesus, the events of that time based on that passage, because those knew how long this temple had been this restoration project had been going on. So again, it depends on who you look at those years, but sometime in my understanding again, Zondervan would be the late 20s AD there. And then we have in Matthew chapter 24. Wait, it's tough getting old and you can't read anymore. I'm gonna have to get the new glasses next time. I was a little too prideful and said I'll just keep the ones I've got for another year. But I tell you what, in the last 6 months, it has changed a good bit. You go to the eye doctor in your early 40s and everything's always stable. And it's like, oh, you're good like 1 or 2 more years and it's going to change. And sure enough, it does. Changes. And when you spend all days looking at computer screens. 24 verses 1 and 2. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. It's kind of interesting, like, hey, Jesus, look, here's the temple. And he said to him, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will be not torn down." And of course, this was fulfilled in AD 70 with the Romans destroying the temple. Next slide. All right, the Mount of Olives. Again, we're talking about areas just outside of Jerusalem or in that same area that are prominent in the account of Jesus and his time, certainly the Passion Week that week. So this is from a seetheholyland.net site, but the Mount of Olives was one of 3 hills on a long ridge to the east of Jerusalem, is the location of many biblical events. Rising to more than 800 meters, it offers an unrivaled vista of the old city and its environs. And I assume those who have been there have been to that area as well. The hill, also called Mount Olivet, takes its name from the fact that it was once covered with olive trees. Makes sense. And we have documentation, we have historic events in the Old Testament, or discussions about the Mount of Olives in the Old Testament. And we'll read about King David here in a second. After King Solomon turned away from God, he built pagan temples there for the gods of his foreign wives in 1 Kings 11. Ezekiel had a vision of the glory of the Lord ascending from the city and stopping on the Mount of Olives in Ezekiel 11. And Zechariah, which it looks like Sunday nights will be talking about, Zechariah prophesied that in the final victory of the forces of good over the forces of evil, the Lord of hosts would stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mount would be split into 2 from east to west. So it's a prominent area, even in the Old Testament. Next slide, please. So I wanted to look just briefly at, I thought interesting to you, when you think about David and you think about Jesus, obviously David, an imperfect king, but a man after God's heart. Jesus, a perfect man, the Son of God. but just some symbolism, I think, between the two, because it's interesting that David in 2 Samuel 2:30, we read about, and David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. So again, Mount of Olives to the east. David, this particular historic event, it's in the context of Absalom. Absalom has, there's a coup. Absalom's taken over, or is about to take over. David is forced to flee, and he flees to the east, and he ascends up the Mount of Olives as he's trying to head out. And he wept at that time. Certainly, I know his emotions are many. Obviously, losing the kingdom is a big one, but your son turning against you is probably the bigger one, I would assume. And then Matthew 24:3, we see Jesus, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." And we have there at the Mount of Olives what many commentators or writers would call the Olivet Discourse, or some talk about Jesus really having 5 specific major teachings. When I mean teachings, like major kind of sermons or major groups of teachings, the Sermon on the Mount certainly being one. But this particular one, the Olivet Discourse, looks at the destruction of the temple, the second coming, and the final judgment. And just see again the prominence of David and Jesus, and some symbolism there I see with this particular setting. Next slide, please. The Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane, again from Britannica. This is a photo, a more modern day photo that's thought to be in the vicinity of where the garden would be. Again, we know where the Mount of Olives is, but these last 2 spots, it's a little bit, again, modern day wise, not exactly clear. But the Garden of Gethsemane was across the Kindred Valley on the Mount of Olives, a ridge paralleling the eastern part of Jerusalem, where Jesus is said to have prayed on the night of his rest before the crucifixion. The name Gethsemane, which means oil presses, suggests that the garden was a grove of olive trees in which was located an area for pressing oil. And this is from a churchoftheholysepulchre.com website that they talk about that. So what we have with the garden, next slide. Matthew 26. Then Jesus came with them to the place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, yet to as I will, but as you will." And I didn't put all the whole stretch in here. I just set the scene with verse 36, skip down to verse 39, and then in verse 41, keep watching and praying that you may not enter temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I find the garden story, the garden events to be some of the most emotional events of Christ's time on this earth, and really in the entire Scripture, as he sits and prays and recognizes the difficulties that he's about to face. Even though he's the Son of God, he is also a human man, and the torture and the torment that he's about to face, and he summons up the will and the courage to go through with it. And he recognizes that, again, the idea of the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, which I think all of us can relate to in certain times in our lives where, we feel like inside that we maybe we could go on and do something, but sometimes it just feels like the body's not able to get it done, can't accomplish that task. Next slide, please. And then Luke 22, 39 through 44. And he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him, and being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. Only Luke mentions an angel, to my understanding, and looking back through, I think this was correct. Only Luke mentions an angel being there and strengthening Jesus at this time. There are other gospel writers that mention angels ministering to Jesus at another time, I believe, but only Luke talks about it with this particular event. Only Matthew and Mark specify Gethsemane when you look at this passage in the narrative. The other writers do not. John actually just says an olive grove. So obviously olive grove is what Gethsemane was, but they don't mention specifically Gethsemane. Also, this is a passage that certainly a lot of people will talk about from just the sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. There are some that would say that Jesus experienced something called hemihydrosis, which is where in extreme stress or agony, like sweat can really be blood. That I've never seen in my life, and doesn't mean it didn't happen here. I've always thought this to be more of a like a metaphor for just how intense, how emotional, how passionate Jesus was at this time, and just the stress and the agony of what he's facing and what happened. But again, I don't know the answer to that. No, none of us do. But we do see that this was clearly an agonizing time for our Savior. So I think it's always important to look back at the Garden of Gethsemane. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Golgotha or Calvary. I was looking at the songs that were sung, I think, first service. Did you guys sing the Old Rugged Cross, I think? Is that right? And this was, again, something I was talking to my dad about this yesterday, because when we think of Calvary and we think of Golgotha, or where Jesus was crucified, you always hear on a hill, Mount Calvary, or on that hill. There's nothing in the Bible that says that Golgotha was a hill. We don't know that. All we know is, what it means, which is place of a skull. But we sing a lot of songs that talk about that. And we don't know specifically, again, where that is today. Now, there are two specific places that most historians would advocate as being likely. This is a picture near what's called the Damascus Gate. The hill is thought to bear resemblance. This is from Britannica. The hill is thought to bear resemblance to a skull. And then actually that was from this website called Every Day with God. But from Britannica, the hill of execution, they say hill as well, but again, we don't have anything scripture that to my knowledge says hill, was outside the city walls of Jerusalem, apparently near a road and not far from the sepulchre where Jesus was buried. Its exact location is still uncertain, but most scholars prefer either the spot now covered by what's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or a hill called Gordon's Calvary just north of the Damascus Gate. And that's the picture you see there that I think, as I was looking on the internet, this seems to be the site that more likely could have been where Jesus was crucified. But again, you can sing the song, but again, you can correct me on this later, but I don't think there's anything that talks about a hill. We just don't know. Could have been a hill, but we don't know. Next slide, please. Matthew 27, 33 through 35. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, and they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. And after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by lots. And this is Zondervan, again, just to extend on what I was talking about. This is the Zondervan commentary that I use. It may have been a small hill, though the Gospels say nothing of a hill, that looked like a skull, or it may have been so named because of the many executions that took place there. So again, that seems possible, that, hey, this is a place where they crucified a lot of people, so they call it the place of a skull. Makes sense. But again, we don't know. Next slide. So in the book, and we're going to get done a little early, so happy Mother's Day gift to all you mothers out there. You can get to the restaurant or get home, and hopefully somebody else is doing the cooking for you today. In our household, we're doing Olive Garden takeout today so that nobody has to do any work, including dessert. Tiramisu today. So Jesus in Jerusalem, if you look in the book, the 5 weeks, the writer Chad Ramsey outlines these kind of 3 headings, 3 visits, and those specific events were when Jesus was an infant, taken there. You have the story, the historic events of Simeon and Anna, I believe. I'm just blanking now, but it's Anna. And then as a young boy, of course, the known events of when he was there, and then he got lost from his parents, and he was in the temple. As an adult, of course, we have lots of information we've talked about. And then he talks about making himself known, the prediction of his death, cleansing the temple, and then the first slide we looked at, that morning of Jerusalem, that verse about, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." We have his final hours, which again would be that Passion Week, thinking about his, I would say, his triumphal, that whole week, his triumphal entry, his teachings on the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, his trial, the Last Supper. I'm not doing those events in order, obviously, but all the things that go with that week. And then the crucifixion and the resurrection. So what I wanted to try to do again next week was to look at that final week of Jesus's life. Again, obviously he was raised at the end of that week, but those final events, and try to look at some of those events and again frame them within the area of Jerusalem where they occurred as best I can do, because a lot of these events and stories we've talked about a lot here in this past few months that we've been looking at the life of Jesus. So I not that to be different, but I want to try to at least look at it in a little different framework to close. And again, you could do a year's worth of lessons on this material. So it's a lot of stuff to try to get through when you're looking at Jerusalem. And to close the last slide here, I just want to, as we get into next week, the prediction of his death, Matthew 20:17 through 19. And again, he's not in Jerusalem when he says this. He's on his way there. As Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves. And on the way, he said to them, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him. And on the third day, he will be raised up." Again, if you watch the series, The Chosen, the folks that produced that, obviously they use a lot of, there's a lot of creativity they use in looking at some of the characters, the actual men that were Jesus' apostles, and so there are things there that we don't know that they use just to help from an entertainment value, but try to put yourselves in their position as they're about to go up that week to Jerusalem, and they hear this prophecy from Jesus about what's going to happen, and think about what's going on in their heads as they head to Jerusalem with him for this last week of his life, and what's going to happen and how they're going to deal with that. And I think that's a good preparation for where we'll try to go next week as we look at that entire narrative. And again, obviously not a great amount of detail because we don't have that much time, and a little bit of detail. So done a little bit early, but that's where I wanted to get to today. Any comments or any thoughts before we head out? Jay. Yeah. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's the one. Again, there's some debate, again, because of where it sits in Jerusalem, is my understanding. That's why they're not, it's not clear, but yeah, right. Right. And I think it was Helen, I think, is Constantine's mother, I think you're talking about. So I think that's who she was. But Jay's just talking about some history about Constantine's mother, who wanted to find the location of Jesus' crucifixion, and how the Romans tried to keep that site from them. And again, ultimately, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built at the site that at the time they thought was the site. And so that's, again, one of the two sites that are mentioned is thought to be most likely. But again, there's debate. There's not clear consensus on the site. Any other questions or thoughts? You guys have a great day. Thanks for your patience and willingness to listen. Thank you.